Arirang Special.
Hello and welcome to this very special edition from Arirang TV. This is South Korea-China ties in 2017 as we usher in the new year based on the Lunar New Year holidays. Now, here in the studio with me to help us through this coverage or this dialogue is Lee Do-won, Professor of Economics at Yonsei University. Thank you so much for being here. And over in Beijing, we link up with our CGTN partners, Zhou Yue, anchor at CGTN. Hello there.
Hi, Jan.
And there with your expert, Mr. Tang Jian-chen, Director of Center of Arms Control at China Institute of International Studies. Now, we have a plethora of topics to cover between South Korea and China, so let's get this discussion rolling. In terms of the 2017, I think it's a global concern worldwide of a rise in trade protectionism. I mean, we're seeing the Donald Trump administration inaugurated in the U.S., Brexit in the U.K., and a rise in nationalism in Europe. And due to these trends, possible trade protectionism on that front is a concern for the Korean economy, and I'm sure for the Chinese economy as well. What would you say is one of the biggest challenges that we face in 2017, both for Korea and China?
Good. I think you already mentioned it. Externally speaking, the uncertainties that is caused by the President-elect Donald Trump of the USA, that would be the common concern both to China and Korea because we depend on international trade a lot. And it's not just the trade. Actually, the capital market uncertainties and uncertainties in the foreign exchange market, and all of these things will be unraveled probably within a couple of months. Domestically speaking, both China and Korea also have a common problem. We do experience a slowdown of economic growth rate, both in China and Korea. And this slowdown of growth rate actually causes many other side effects. And how to deal with these side effects will be the main concern. And of course, I will talk more about all those problems and the remedies.
Right. What about the bilateral relations between South Korea and China in terms of the economic relations? What is your diagnosis here at this point in 2017?
Well, many people were surprised to see the monthly trade data of last year, December 2016. Probably for the first time in 8 years, the bilateral trade volume between Korea and China decreased. We never experienced decreased trade volume with China. It was always increasing after the outbreak of the 2008 global financial crisis. So we are not quite sure whether that's going to be a temporary setback or change of fortune in the long term, but we will see. So that's one of the major concerns. But if you look at the bilateral investment, the investment is still going on pretty high, pretty good. A lot of Chinese investors bring their money to Korea, and they invest into Korean capital market, they invest in Korean real estate market, and sometimes they take over Korean companies. And vice versa is going on as well in terms of the bilateral investment.
So I think this question should also be addressed to our Chinese friends at CGTN. What is your take, both for you and Mr. Tang, what is your take on the bilateral relations between Seoul and Beijing as we usher in the Lunar New Year holidays, but as we usher in 2017 based on that?
Yes, indeed. Jennifer, as you mentioned, both China and South Korea have been meeting headwinds from around the world because of the uncertainties brought about by Brexit and the Trump administration. But bilaterally, as Mr. Lee just mentioned, the trade has been declining, which is very unusual between ROK and China. Is this because of structural problems, or is it because of the political uncertainties on both sides?
I think for the first time that the trade between the two sides is declining in recent months. This is actually a result of the political struggle in this region and the a result of the decision made by the ROK leaders to deploy the military system in their country. And there are a lot of response from the Chinese side. They try to put pressure on the ROK side to really think about the decision and to be very careful in dealing with any challengeable system in that country.
But officially, there isn't any trade restriction policies from the Chinese government authorities on Korean imports and exports.
Yeah.
So where does this come from?
Actually, this is an emotional feeling from the public or from the companies. For example, some businessmen are feeling that the situation or the condition at this moment, for the trade between China and ROK is not so good. So they, suspend or just slow down the step to go ahead because of the uncertainty in politics in the diplomatic relation between the two countries.
So this is the public sentiment from the Chinese, Jennifer. Many Chinese businesses and individuals are less willing to make trade with South Korea because of your government's decision to deploy THAAD in South Korea, which will hurt the strategic interests of China. I wonder what's Mr. Lee's take on this?
Right. So, Professor Lee, your take on this?
Well, first of all, I'm very surprised to hear that Mr. Tang just mentioned that because of South Korea's decision to employ THAAD, the trade volume declined. That's not the official stance of the Chinese government. Chinese government always denied that they did not put any, direct influence or retaliatory matter
Absolutely.
on trade.
UA actually just noted that Chinese government does not have an official stance of economic retaliation.
That used to be the
kind.
official stance of the Chinese government. But now Mr. Tang just mentioned that probably it's not because of the government policy, but because of the public emotional reaction against the import and export of Korea, which made the trade volume decline. Well, if that is so, I think we have a serious problem because changing the public emotion is very difficult, especially in the short time. But I do not really believe that the shrinking of trade volume was purely because of these political and security issues. There are lots of other economic factors that is responsible for the decline of the bilateral trade volume. First of all, China is trying to change its growth strategy from trade-dependent model to be more domestic-dependent model. So they will try to reduce their dependence on the import of Korean capital equipment and Korean intermediate product for their growth. Instead, China will try to promote their growth by depending on domestic consumption and domestic production. So naturally, South Korea's export of all those intermediate products to China had to decline. I think it's an inevitable trend. And more than anything else, as I just mentioned, we do not know whether this is just a temporary setback or reversal of fortune. We really have to take a look, at least for a couple of months, to see whether this is a long-term trend.
Right. So Yue, just to pick up on what you said about THAAD deployment, of course, from your point of view, that may be the case for Chinese point of view, but of course, South Korea's official stance has been the deployment of U.S. sophisticated anti-missile system or missile defense system to South Korean soil is, of course, to deter North Korean threats, the continuous threats that we face, and this is for the national security and sovereignty of this country. Now, I'd like to ask you about the remedies, because with diagnosis should come the remedy. So how do we make better this relationship?
It seems that the South Koreans really worry about their strategic security because of the threats from North Korea. And China said THAAD is more a weakening of China's deterrence capability than a deterrence against North Korea's strike capabilities. So it's a different understanding of this system deployment. How can we narrow our differences, or is it possible?
Actually, we do have different approaches to understand the deployment of that. the ROK always said it's a security issue. But in China, officials and scholars always argue this is actually a strategic issue because it hurt strategic capability of China, especially when that system deployed in ROK and directly targeted at China. I don't think that can give any efficient protection from the missile development of DPRK. And this is a very important point, I think. It's not issue between China and ROK. It's an issue between China and the United States. So I think ROK leaders should be very careful in dealing with such a sensitive issue. This is actually one part of U.S. missile defense plan in Asia-Pacific region.
So, Jennifer, it seems the Chinese remedy is we should think bigger, have a bigger picture of what is happening in Northeast Asia rather than thinking only of ourselves. I don't know whether your expert, Mr. Lee, shares the same concerns?
Right. So,
Sure.
Professor Lee, do you agree with them? I mean, I think their point of view, we have a very big gap in the understanding of the deployment of THAAD. And of course, I'd like to disagree with Mr. Tang in China, saying that this missile defense system is directly targeted at China, which is not, because from our point of view, from South Korea's point of view, this is purely defensive in nature. Of course, this is a very sensitive issue, like Yue said, that needed to be thought through properly. And I believe the South Korean government has done that and came to a final decision that we do in fact need THAAD, and we've given China assurance of on various occasions that this will not be used against China in any way. Do you have a take on this?
You know, I'm an economist, so I'm not quite sure whether I'm qualified to answer all those questions. But I would like to point out a couple of things. First of all, this is not just an issue between China and USA. Definitely, South Korea is directly involved. North Korea is involved. Japan has a very key concern on this issue too, and of course, USA. So this is a very important regional issue in Northeast area, not just an issue between something that has to be solved between China and USA. And then, if you go further, the origin of all these problems is North Korea nuclear program.
Right.
If there was no such a serious violation of international conduct, then we don't have to worry about this. And the key to resolve this North Korean nuclear program actually lies in China.
Right.
China has, more than anything else, have the biggest economic, political, security leverage over North Korea. And the general impression from the USA, Japan, and Korea is that China has not played that leverage effectively so far. Now, let me give you just one example. In the middle of the 1990s, we had also the nuclear issue of North Korea. North Korea was about to test those nuclear program. Of course, it was very early stage at the time. So, international community proposed six-party talk. And of course, North Korea denied. They do not want it to come to six-party. Just like China is trying to resolve this with USA, North Korea wanted to talk only with USA. But then, you know what happened? I think that's 1994, 1995. China cut the supply of oil to North Korea for something like 4 months or 5 months. And almost immediately, North Korean leader at the time gave up, and he agreed to join six-party talk. This can be a very good example that China still have a very effective leverage over North Korea to resolve this issue.
So I think all in all, whether that may be issues regarding security issues such as the deployment of THAAD or North Korea's nuclear issue, you know, we're living in a very intertwined world that all these different parties, may that be South Korea, North Korea, China, US, Japan, or whatnot, Russia, we all need to work together to remedy or to resolve any kind of issue that relates to this region.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of the six-party talks, I'd like to pick up Yue there with North Korea's nuclear threats, if you don't mind. Now, as Professor Lee pointed out, China obviously holds the key in resolving this North Korea's nuclear issue. Of course, I'd like to point out that China in recent days have stood up for the international community and joined in multilateral sanctions of various kind by the UNSC and whatnot. What is your view? What is China's view on North Korea's nuclear threats, and how do you foresee that growing in 2017?
I think China and the United States and ROK both agree that nuclear development in North Korea is unacceptable. The only difference is how to tackle this. It seems the South Koreans and the Americans think it is China's responsibility and solely China's responsibility to return North Korea from a nuclear development path. But China definitely doesn't think so.
This is not a nuclear issue itself. It's actually geopolitical competition among the parties concerned, because the United States would like to have some tension in the peninsula, so they can have excuse to deploy their military forces, and also to maintain the military alliance with ROK and with Japan. You can imagine, without such a tension, what would the United States do?
What do you think is the biggest stakeholder in this, and who should bear the most of the responsibilities, and who should make the initiative to do something?
Of course, I think the United States should play the leading role in this game, because it's a large country, it possesses nuclear weapons, and also its policy toward the Northeast Asia gave some negative impact on the situation in this region.
But it is the United States' stance that if we talk to Pyongyang, it seems to be kind of a reward for developing their nuclear strategy.
Yeah, this is not a reward. Actually, the international community tried its best in the past years, and they tried to give some reward to DPRK for the freezing of the nuclear and the missile program, but DPRK, I mean the leaders of DPRK, denied to give any further cooperation in this regard. Actually, the nuclear bomb and the missile program have already become the bargaining stake in the hand of DPRK.
And Mr. Lee mentioned that in the 1990s, when China decided to cut oil supply to Pyongyang, it seemed to have worked. But now it's a different leader in power in North Korea, and also a different time. Do you think China has used this leverage to the best?
Yeah, I'm sure Chinese government in recent years has imposed all the sanctions against DPRK according to UN Security Council resolution. We have at least several resolutions related to the DPRK nuclear issue. But some countries, try to, for example, maintain the strategic patience, and also try to manipulate the situation in the Korean Peninsula. ROK and China should be very careful in this regard, because any ups and downs, or even a war, that will cause direct lose for the two countries. So this is a very important issue for ROK and China.
Also, Jennifer, U.S. will have a new president, and probably the political scandal in your own country will lead to kind of a political shake-up. What will the political development in both United States and your country impact your economy and your economic cooperation with China?
Right. Before I answer that, Yue, I'd like to pick up on the previous point of North Korea's nuclear issue. Of course, South Korea's decision to deploy THAAD is purely defensive of nature, like we stated. And when we talk about North Korea and China's role in denuclearizing North Korea, I don't think South Korea or any other country holds China solely responsible to bring back North Korea to the denuclearization talks. In fact, if any country is responsible, it should be North Korea in and of itself over their obligation to really stick to the resolutions by the UNSC. But what the rest of the world or international community is trying to say is that China is the most influential over North Korea, and that because of that structure of China having the most influence over North Korea, it's actually China that holds the key in this and who can actually play the big brother role for North Korea, if you will, in trying to denuclearize North Korea. Now, in terms of the U.S. administration and the Korea's political situation and how
Let me
this
respond to you to whether China has done enough. Well, China does have leverages over North Korea. China has actually submitted to the plan by UN to have the quota of coal export and also cut its financial transactions with the outside world. But it seems many countries expect China to cut all supply, including food and energy supply. Is that realistic in the first place? And will that make a difference on North Korea's decision to pursue its nuclear program?
First, I should say I think the people today use the old, approach to think about the role played by the Chinese government. Actually, after the normalization of relations between ROK and China, DPRK has completely suspended all the normal channels to the Chinese government, and they even had no, noticement before their nuclear test. So this is actually a big change after the normalization of relations between China and ROK. And the DPRK completely abandoned the normal relations with China, and I don't think China today has any significant impact or influence on the decision making of DPRK leaders.
So those supplies of food and energy were more out of humanitarian concerns rather than prop up a government that is sovereign and make its decision on its own. That's China's argument.
Yeah, this is our only assistance to the DPRK at this moment. Yeah.
So I don't know whether the South Koreans can understand China's stance here and the difficulties Chinese have been experiencing by working between both Pyongyang and Seoul.
I mean, sure, Yue. I mean, point well noted and taken that. And South Korea and the rest of the world were in no way holding China responsible over this, like I said, and that claiming that China wasn't doing enough on that front. Perhaps I think the point here is that the only party right now that could play a bigger role in this could be China, is I think what the rest of the world is suggesting. Now, Professor Lee, I'd like to ask you, is there anything in terms of economic I suppose, measures that China could do, impose on North Korea to better bring them out to the rest of the world and give up its nuclear weapons?
Well, before I answer this question, I totally agree with the comment of Yue that it's very difficult to deal with North Korea.
It is,
Anyone who
surely.
deals with North Korea will face difficulties. We face a dilemma. If we put too much sanction, that will make their regime difficult to survive, but at the same time, it makes North Korean people difficult to survive as well. That's why probably there are some people who always advocate humanitarian support for North Korea. But there's a limitation to do that. At the time of urgency like this, I think we have to think about more strategically. Sometimes we have to put aside humanitarian aspect and emphasize more on sticks and punishment for the right behavior. In that matter, in that sense, China still have a couple of things to do, economically speaking. China is the only trading partner to North Korea. And the major export item of North Korea to China is mineral resources, especially coal. If China reduces the import of these natural resources from North Korea, then that will greatly reduce the inflow of hard currency to North Korea. And in order to gain hard currency, North Korea export laborers to various countries, and especially to China. Many North Korean laborers are working in China just like slaves. And all the money they earn in China are sent back to North Korea, definitely not for the sake of the North Korean people, but for the sake of the North Korean regime. We do not know how much of that money was used personally by Kim Jong-un or illegally to develop North Korea program. Another thing China can do is to cut the border trade between North Korea and China. One of the key supply lines for the North Korean economy was the border trade, which is actually more like a smuggling between North Korea and China. If China effectively reduce or restrict this border trade, that will be a very, very critical blow to the North Korean economy. So even these couple of measures can be very effective even before you think about cutting the supplies of oil.
Right, so there are a couple of cards that China has that it can use towards denuclearizing North Korea. Of course, South Korea we need to do our share in terms of trying to denuclearize North Korea, because this is, all in all, as much as it's an international problem, it's also a very Korean problem. South Korea, of course, last year shut down the joint industrial complex as a protest against North Korea's nuclear weapons and to really dry them up with hard currency to develop those nuclear weapons. I think it's a problem that Chinese officials and South Korean officials, along with US and Japanese and Russian, so the rest of the six-party members should get together and really, lay out a blueprint, a fine blueprint in order to basically convince North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons. Of course, it's been time and time again tried and failed, but that needs to be done. Let me pick up at Yue's point about U.S. administration, the Trump administration coming in. Now, with the Trump administration, of course, there's going to be policy change vis-a-vis North Korea. Of course, it looks like there will be a change in its trade policy and all. What are some of the key changes that we foresee with the Donald Trump administration coming into the U.S.?
Well, everybody say that President-elect Donald Trump is going to impose a lot of uncertainties over the global economy. That's true, but there are a couple of things that is for sure, that is certain. One thing is that protectionism is going to rise. However, it seems like it's not going to rise as much as Mr. Trump mentioned when he was the presidential candidate. He explicitly mentioned something like 44% retaliatory duties on the import from China, but I don't think that he will impose 44% retaliatory duty on China, maybe 10%, maybe 5%, and only in the selective industries. However, even though it is limited, protection is going to rise. In that sense, I think President Xi Jinping of China made a very timely and accurate statement at the Davos Forum a couple of days ago. He warned the danger of the protectionism, and there's nobody to gain when the global retaliatory trade war goes on. Another thing for sure is that Trump will support strong dollar policy. And this is not exactly bad news to countries like Korea and China, because it means that our local currency will be, relatively speaking, weakened, and that is going to help our export competitiveness to be recovered. However, if strong dollar policy goes on too long, then it can cause instability in the global capital market, global financial sector. And there's a great deal of uncertainty there, because we do not know how much it's going to affect and to which country it's going to affect. But it seems like it has already affected China particularly. But there's a pressure on the Chinese renminbi that renminbi will be weakened, and because of the fear of the weakening renminbi, there is some sign of capital flight from Chinese capital market. So we have to deal with it together. Now, that's a common ground that Korea and China can cooperate.
Right, sure. So let me toss this question to China, our friends in China. So how do you foresee China navigating the trade waters with the Donald Trump administration coming in?
As Mr. Lee just mentioned, Mr. Xi Jinping just pointed out at the Davos meeting, China will be a championing for free trade and globalization. This is going to be the policy for China for a long time to come. And some say China has been the biggest beneficiary and now probably the standard bearer for newer round of free trade agreements.
Yeah, before you answer the question, I'd like to have two corrections on the point made by Professor Lee. First, I don't think China is the largest market for the labor from DPRK. Actually, Mongolia has been the largest market for DPRK's labor. And the second, I don't think the smuggling across border is a regular activities for the two sides, for China and for DPRK. I've been to the border area for several times, and I talked to the officials in the county, in the cities, and they all said this time the Chinese government did give a very tough, border control and no smuggling by the officials. And of course, we have a long border. I'm sure there should be a loopholes in the border control, but I don't think even the local authorities gave any support to the smuggling. Or in terms of the trade, as mentioned by the coal. The coal trade between China and the DPRK. If you look at the website of our Ministry of Commerce, actually, Chinese government has already suspended almost all the coal trade from DPRK according to
and the new UN sanctions that China
according
ratified,
to the UN Security Council's resolution, we suspended almost all the coal trade with DPRK. This is actually a commitment from our government, both central government and also the local authorities. And to answer your question, I think this is really a challenge for the globalization of world economy. And you mentioned that some countries, especially the president-elect of the United States, Donald Trump, denied such a tendency. I think that might be a negative, factor for the cooperation in trade and the economy in the world. But I don't think it will give any significant, impact on the future of our world economy. This is the tendency, at least. In recent 30 years, we have witnessed the globalization of world economy, and we enjoyed the development of world economy, especially in this regard. So I think we might, slow down the development in the globalization of world economy, but this is actually a tendency. For example, the trade amount between China and the United States last year almost reached $600 billion. Can we stop such trade? It's impossible.
So definitely a lot of issues that China and South Korea and China must discuss to narrow the gap. So perceptions may vary, but the ultimate goal in the end that we share is also very important and noteworthy. All right, that's just about all the time we have. Thank you, Professor Lee, for helping us through this. And thank you there at CGTN, Zhou Yue, for that, as well as Mr. Tang, your expert there. And thank you to our viewers for staying through this coverage. And this is the end of South Korea-China forecast in 2017.